Often it feels like we're at the beck and call of nature, that nature's power can overwhelm us and take command in our lives. But what if we think of nature as our ally in adaptation and climate readiness? What if we could turn to nature to help us mitigate many of the disasters and hazards that frequent our lives? Nature-based solutions offer exactly this promise, and that's the topic of today's show. I'm Weston Twardowski, the Associate Director of Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and the Associate Director of Eco Studio and Rice Sustainability's Institute, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. On today's show, we're talking with Professor Jim Blackburn of the Rice Speed Center and Dr. Carrie Masiello, the Director of the Rice Sustainability Institute, all about nature-based solutions. Jim Blackburn, Carrie Masiello, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining. So the idea for this conversation really came together because, both of you are leaders and thinkers around nature-based solutions broadly as it is, but you just hosted a whole conference on exactly that topic. And so I was excited both to attend, which I found really fascinating conversations and ideas going on at the conference that we'll dive into in a little bit, but also just to hear from both of you a little bit more. We'll start at the high level with just, what are nature-based solutions, and then think through some of those more specifically. But to start us off, nature-based solutions, what does that even mean?
I think that's a great question. And to answer it, you sort of have to start by asking solutions to what? So
now we're in one of my classes. This is what I always tell the students.
Oh, yeah.
So I think Jim and I have both worked on nature-based solutions from similar and sometimes slightly different angles. And so Houston is an awesome, fabulous candidate for nature-based solutions, both to managing flooding and then also to atmospheric CO2 removal. And so you'll hear about nature-based solutions talked about in both of those contexts. And I guess I would ask Jim, can you think of other contexts for nature-based solutions beyond CO2 removal and flood mitigation?
Well, I think it can enhance water supply as well.
Okay.
So I think there are aspects there, but it's sort of like most of the traditional engineering, particularly civil engineering types of issues, I think are susceptible to what we used to call non-structural flood control or non-structural water supply, but really thinking in terms of nature being an ally, which is, frankly, something engineers have never done particularly well. We've always, engineering's always been about conquering nature, about whipping the floodwaters into submission, and we're at a point where we're way beyond being able to do that with the size of storms we're talking about. We've got to learn to work with nature in a totally different way. And I think it started off by thinking in terms of environmental impact and just how negative were our impact, and now really moving toward nature's a partner. And as a lawyer, that's a really wonderful change to see. And there's all sorts of interesting legal sides to this as well.
I love that you're hitting on that kind of historic relationship. I think of who I might frame as one of the worst offenders in this kind of nature is the enemy thinking would be the Army Corps, who, multiple director heads of the Army Corps in the past have said things along the lines of nature is our enemy, and really meaning that in this very we're up against nature, we're trying to beat nature, and that's a tough enemy. But that's a frame of mind that maybe is not most conducive to some of these other ways we could imagine living.
Well, it was a mindset, I think, that served us well. If you go back even to biblical times, nature was an enemy. Lions and tigers could kill you. We were very much at the mercy of nature in a way that we're not at the mercy of nature anymore. And I think that's one of the principal changes is I think the relationship between humans and the natural system has kind of evolved to a point where it needs to be developed in almost all disciplines here at Rice in the educational world. I'm very interested in the spiritual connection with nature, which I think reinterpretations of the Bible are beginning to get into. So I think you're having almost I would say almost across the board reinterpretations of nature as a partner, spiritual partner, financial partner, engineering partner in ways that we've never thought of before.
And I love the frame of partnership as well because it also moves us a little bit away from kind of, I think, a lot of classic arguments by environmentalists from the 60s on around, nature is something to be protected and cared for, and actually moves us to something where nature has some autonomy in this. Nature is powerful, and actually working with that rather than against it, working certainly, to protect nature, but also imagining the ways that nature can actually help us and can be of use to cities and places as well. That feels like a very different frame. So I'm excited to hear that. So what I've heard so far, just to go back a little bit, Carrie, to your point, for Houston in particular, it sounds like you're thinking about water, both in terms of flooding, but also in terms of maybe water supply. And then, as you'd mentioned, atmospheric carbon. So we're thinking about greenhouse gas emissions and the way nature can help us mitigate some of those that are contributing to climate change. The other one that I might throw out is heat, which I think...
oh, that's a great point.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a project we're just starting through the Sustainability Institute to, it's called Relief A-Leaf, and it's a project we started with the help of Jaime Gonzalez when he was at the Nature Conservancy to plant a lot more trees around some of the schools in A-Leaf ISD because trees really dramatically increase everybody's quality of life, especially in Houston. We see as much as a 10-degree difference across the city at the same time of day, depending on whether or not you have enough or not enough tree cover.
I mean, yeah, that is very stark. And I think as you're getting at, certainly the canopy is important there, but it also impacts air quality, and it impacts a number of other kinds of environmental things you might imagine, even just getting into, it's nice to be around trees. It's a far more pleasant living environment, which I think is something that's actually an important part of how we imagine the role of nature in some of this work. So let's go back a little bit. Maybe we start with water. What are some of the ways that we can use in these different water issues you've mentioned that nature can help us, especially if I think for folks who, when we think of flooding, we think of the awesome, terrifying might maybe of flooding, which you were kind of hinting at with the biblical there, Jim. And so are there ways that we can actually leverage more natural solutions to help us address flooding?
Well, yeah, there are many, and I think we're really working over at the Severe Storm Center. We call it the Speed Center. We're doing a lot of work on that, but take a storm like Harvey. You're not going to control Harvey. I mean, you had, 45 inches of rain in 5 days, 27 inches in 24 hours. I mean, huge volumes of water. We're going to have to make room for water. And I think that is part of this is learning what nature needs. I mean, we have tried to come in and impose our will on a natural landscape. And now I think we're going to start resettling urban areas to basically let nature have more role. In this case of flooding, it means giving it room to actually flood. We're not going to confine the flooding to concrete channels and incised bayous. But that's a mind shift. A lot of engineers would tell you they have failed if we haven't collapsed Buffalo Bayou into a single channel. And I think that is, frankly, a totally wrong way to be looking at it. I think these natural areas like floodplains need to be ultimately abandoned over time. That's a big step. I mean, we have probably 150, 200,000 homes in Harris County that probably will be relocated over the next 20 to 40 years.
Wow.
So our past patterns have locked us into certain damage risks. I think we're in the process of reevaluating those risks and, frankly, thinking about how to resettle. We're going to have sea level rise down on the coast. We're going to have to, on the one hand, put defenses up to some extent, but over time we may be moving back. And again, those are not commonly accepted solutions in the engineering world. And how we think and talk about that, I think, becomes very important.
We have some great examples that I'm sure folks who are listening have already seen of some nature-based solutions to flooding. I'm thinking about the floodable dog park on Buffalo Bayou. There are a bunch of Buffalo Bayou Conservancy has put some great floodable bayou, floodable parks And then I was just thinking about Willow Water Hole down at that southwest corner of 610 is another great example of a floodable park. Just whole, I remember the engineer who designed that. I asked him if that was going to have any impact on property values. I was talking with him while he was building Willow Water Hole, and he got this beautiful smile and he said, yes. And I said, when do you think that will happen? And he said, the second I unlock these gates, everybody's property values are going to go up because everybody's floodplain classification is going to get higher.
Yeah, and I think we're also, seeing, we're going to see bigger floodplains in the upcoming floodplain maps. In Harris County, we've always treated floodplains as impediments to development. Those are that's red tape to be overcome. And I think we're going to have to start perceiving these things differently. Carrie mentioned something that I think is really not understood. From an ecological richness standpoint, Houston, Harris County, the Houston-Galveston region is a fabulous ecological resource. And we've never exploited that in terms of our identity as a metropolitan region. I would think if there were areas on the East Coast or West Coast that had the ecological resources that Houston has, you'd know all about it. But we don't talk about that. And I think a lot of it has to do with being an oil industry town, because in a way the oil industry has always considered they can drill anywhere, they can go. And so becoming attached to the natural environment may have been a bit of an anathema to the oil and gas industry. But I think that's changing, because much of what Carrie and I are collaborating on these days is that nature-based carbon dioxide removal credits may become an ally of the future of the oil and gas industry in ways that I think they would have never conceived.
Something that's occurring to me, because I think I agree with you in one sense, and I might throw out a counter, actually, that, I think if we look at the 60s and 70s of the oil and gas industry, it's not a coincidence that the Woodlands, this master planned community that's meant to be feeling like you're in nature, feeling like you're in the woods, was helmed by an oil and gas tycoon. Like, its existence is because of an oil and gas tycoon. And so I think, there was an attachment to nature, but a particular frame, perhaps, of nature. I think Houstonians, understandably, and I'm going back to your dog park example, get really uncomfortable with seeing any flooding, right? And understandably, we've had homes flooded multiple times. We drive out on the streets, and if there's a heavy rain, suddenly, you're wondering, do I just have to pull into somebody's driveway for an hour and wait this out? So I understand completely why Houstonians fear flooding, but I think we also, when we see that water buildup, it means we think something is wrong, that, the system isn't working, and that there has to be some awareness of, actually, these are spaces we've designed to do this, to prevent that flooding from reaching your house, to try to off-put that. And to your point on Willow Water Hole, which is minutes from where I live and was a major reason of why I chose to live in that area, it's absolutely, I will tell you, from last summer when I was looking at real estate, every ad included walkable to Willow Water Hole. So I think part of what's shifting is not just a cultural awareness of there are different ways we can live with nature, and there are different kinds of nature we might imagine. We see the same with real estate values around Buffalo Bayou over the last decade have just astronomically shot up as we've realized more and more what an incredibly valuable resource that is, certainly ecologically, but also as a parkway, also as an access point to other parkways. That's become such a vital part of that community. And so I think, what feels like it's shifting to me is there's a new kind of economic incentive and motive as people are starting to recognize, these are different ways we can actually amplify our economic wealth by investing in the natural resources around us. And that can not only help keep us safer, but can also add meaningfully to our quality of life. I'm curious if that resonates.
I'm not sure that's new. I think about the actions of George Bush in preventing Buffalo Bayou from being channelized. That portions of our community have always wanted. I think portions of our community have always had the resources to demand that their environments be beautiful and recharging, and naturally lovely.
Oh, certainly. And I think, yeah, there's a whole longer political argument to who's been able to be involved in conservation, really from the foundation of conservation. I do feel there's been a cultural shift, and particularly post-Harvey in Houston, with the reinvigoration of Memorial Park, say, which has been an astronomical kind of redesign of that space, an investment in Buffalo Bayou in particular. That Buffalo Bayou in the 90s, even when it was prevented from being channelized, did not look like Buffalo Bayou today. I have seen the photos, and they are very different parks.
Well, I used to take my rice class back in the late 70s, the 80s, the 90s. We'd go down Buffalo Bayou. That was part of the class. And there was a place where the raw sewage came in from basically River Oaks. And I mean, it was a nasty bayou at that point in time. And there has been now that's some of the legal stuff. That Clean Water Act made a big impact on Buffalo Bayou, and we've protected a lot of wetlands with the regulatory provisions of the Clean Water Act. But I think what we're seeing now is a huge shift from almost the amenity value of nature, the cultural, recreational value of nature, to the financial partnership part of nature, where basically the ecological services, the services that the natural system provides to us, taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, providing pollination, storing flood waters, those can begin to translate into economic value. And I think that's what's beginning to change, that we are really beginning to merge the human economy with nature's economy. And I think when we get to that, we're going to have something. And that's basically biomimicry, basically the economic system mimicking the ecological system. And we get there, then we're starting to talk about transformational stuff. And that's where my head is in terms of long-term thinking, the circular economy, the idea that we recycle, reuse, everything. That's a nature concept. This is stuff Carrie knows backwards and forwards.
Do you want to add on to that, or?
Jim is so eloquent. I have nothing to add.
What I'll throw in then there maybe is it's a good place to talk about a little bit some of the carbon that you've been talking about, and especially the carbon credit system you mentioned, because I think this is something the two of you have been pioneering here in different ways in Houston, but also I'm curious, if you can walk us through a little bit, what does a carbon credit even mean? Because I think that concept is pretty foreign to a lot of folks. And then what are some of the ways that we're starting to see that and how does that a nature-based solution? I'm curious about how these things relate.
Well, the best technology for carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere is photosynthesis.
Okay.
And on one level, that's free. On another level, humans own property that perform this function. Humans impact photosynthesis every day. So it basically, first of all, to think in terms of solving a problem with photosynthesis, we have to have some way of organizing human activity to work in a particular direction, namely protecting and augmenting the number of trees, the acres of prairie, the acres of marshland that we have. Because photosynthesis in all of those pulls down carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And if you pull 1 ton of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and, say, store it in the soil, a carbon credit registry, which we have formed one out of the Baker Institute at Rice, called B Carbon, and I'm currently the CEO of this nonprofit. This registry can review a proposal, assess it according to a set of rules that the registry has developed, and can issue basically a certificate saying this project has generated X number of tons of carbon dioxide removal and storage. A company can then buy those credits, if you will, and can list that on their accounting sheets as a offset of what they put into the atmosphere. And so that's the carbon crediting concept. What we are learning, and there's a lot yet to be learned, is how these different ecological systems work. Carrie was my mentor in soil carbon, and we've all worked together now for several years just trying to develop ideas, how we prove these ideas, what type of proof is necessary so that someone would actually buy one of these credits. And really the buyer mentality becomes incredibly important. For the most part, this is a voluntary market. No one is forcing the companies, no law is forcing the companies to buy these credits. They have a lot of external pressures. They've got stockholders, they've got shareholders that are very interested. Just they have an interested public. You've got critics like some of the environmental groups, perhaps. You've got the Pope. The Pope wrote the most amazing encyclical called Laudato Si, where basically he has reinterpreted the Bible in a very environmental way, and doing something about climate change has become part of the papal doctrine. Amazing change, but that puts incredible pressure on these companies. You've got ethical, moral, public persuasion, lawsuits out just everywhere about this issue. So they have a lot of pressure to do something, and these carbon credits are one way they can respond.
So, Carrie, Jim hinted at this, but you are a soil scientist. So can you walk us through a little bit how, this process, understand the economic argument here, buying a credit that represents so much carbon and that's being stored, but as Jim mentioned, it's being stored in soil in this case. So what are some of the ways that actually happens? Where is it going? And also, how do we know that it's actually going there?
Yeah, so I think the math is pretty simple. And if you know the difference between gross income and net income, then you're in good shape to understand this. So we emit about 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year from fossil fuel combustion primarily, but also from cement production. And a gigaton is 10 to the 9th tons, but it's a convenient unit. So 10 gigatons go out of our industrial processes into the atmosphere. Photosynthesis pulls about 120 gigatons of CO2 out of the atmosphere every year. So photosynthesis is pulling more than 10 times out of the atmosphere. However, decomposition returns almost exactly the same amount to the atmosphere. So we have these very large background fluxes. We have 120 gigatons being pulled out by plants, but then we have decomposition returning almost identical amounts to the atmosphere. So there's a large in and out gross flux that sums to zero, but then our fossil fuel fluxes are a net flux that's positive into the atmosphere.
So we're adding to the carbon in the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide, and we're not yet compensating to take it back out.
So I mean, it sounds like what you're saying, photosynthesis more or less equals itself out over the course of a year. We're adding 100 gigatons through the various carbon. Does that include methane as well? Is that just greenhouse gases in general, or is that specifically carbon?
10 works for everything.
Cool. Okay.
I think that's right.
Yeah. And so my question then, but that also doesn't address the 100, we can even narrow it down to say like the 1940s to now of what we've been putting out since what we might call the Great Acceleration that started in the 1940s.
So the idea of nature-based solutions is that 120, so right now the amount, the work that nature is doing to the atmosphere is it's putting 120 gigatons in and it's also taking 120 gigatons out. The idea of nature-based solutions is you either make the amount coming out of the atmosphere larger, or you make the amount returned to the atmosphere smaller. So you make that difference positive. So we hold more carbon as plant biomass, or we hold more carbon as soil organic matter, or we hold more carbon as biochar, or as marine carbon, or as minerals in the ocean or soils. So if we can adjust that 120 gigatons by as little as 5%, then we have the potential to create a significant offset in our CO2 emissions.
So here's my question for you then, because I think and I'm biased a little bit here. I did hear you give a talk on this a few weeks ago, so I have some insight here that's leading me. But I think if I were just a listener, I would be thinking, okay, I'm getting the kind of numbers side of, if we can adjust this, that'll help bring down the numbers overall. But I think the question would be, but if it's photosynthesis, like, aren't plants pretty short-lived, and then wouldn't they go into decomposition? And so I'm curious, because I know you do have a handy chart that we can't show because it's radio, sorry. But I know you do have a handy chart of different processes and different time scales. And can you talk a little, because you did mention marine carbon and biochar, and I think those are terms folks probably aren't as familiar with, and they do have, I think, different longevities than, I know, especially here in Houston where it's hot and humid, my compost moves real quick. So
Yes, that's right. Grass does not last on the landscape once you've cut it. Yes. So this is this idea of permanence, which is a characteristic of a carbon credit. So carbon credits are essentially an investment vehicle. And investment vehicles, you can think about stocks, you can think about bonds, you can think about all kinds of things that people buy and sell. And each one of these, take a stock for an example. Some of them can be high risk, some of them can be low risk. And carbon credits also carry a range of different properties. And one property that a carbon credit carries is its permanence. So how long is that carbon dioxide pulled out of the atmosphere? So buying a carbon credit for grass would be terrible, because we've all mowed our grass. We know you mow the grass and it's gone a week later, right? So that was a terrible carbon credit.
That one won't work.
But so there's a significant body of work and conversation right now, both in academia and then also within the business world, trying to figure out how do we choose carbon credits that pull CO2 out of the atmosphere for as long as possible. Because the longer you have it out, then that gives us more time to invent new energy sources. Think about conserving our energy use, improve our energy efficiency. Because ultimately what we need to do is emit less CO2.
And in a way, that's redefining economy. And I think that really what Carrie's talking about is we're trying to basically bridge from where we are to where we will be in a manner that causes less and less harm, and hopefully begins to have a long-term positive drawdown from the atmosphere. I mean, there are companies that are pledging. You mentioned the emissions going back to 1940 or even earlier. Some companies are now pledging to net remove everything they ever put into the atmosphere.
Wow.
So that's for them to be net negative. It's not just net zero. It's not I'm just going to zero it out.
Yeah.
It's they're going to go beyond it. And so we're seeing that type of thinking beginning to emerge, which wasn't talked about 10 years ago. And so, I think and the amazing thing is all of this is happening outside of government. So, people ask me a lot about what's happening today in government and things. One thing I can tell you is a lot of this carbon-related thinking, a lot of certainly the carbon credit business, most of that is happening without any major involvement of government at all. And that makes it truly new. As an environmental lawyer, I cannot describe another subject area other than climate where most of the work has been done outside of the legal system, outside of a set of laws and structures. And I think in 50 years, people will look back and think of this as being really an amazing transition time. Now, we're living it. It is not pretty to watch. There is so many ups and downs. We get mad at each other. We're fussing about this and that. But it is a transitional time. And I think it's hard to know a transition when you're living it. But I think we are truly living. And I think a lot of the frustration that exists comes out of the fact that I think most people know things are changing, but no one quite knows how. And I'm not sure anyone can tell you how. I mean, I'm going to try to write a book about the future of the Texas coast, and it's kind of challenging. What are we going to be looking at? So, but I do think that what Carrie was talking about, we are learning how to manage land to better keep carbon in the soil, perhaps. We're hopefully setting rules up in private preserves and in public lands to keep trees growing longer. If we're harvesting, we basically replant and put that into a much more circular system. Just, cut and burn and replace with agriculture. That's been one of the large negatives. We try to change that over time. With marshes, we're trying to prevent them from being killed by sea level rise by building living shorelines. So we're coming up with interventions that are nature-based, but that involve, in the case of, say, the living shoreline, some engineering modification. But it's with the goal of actually maintaining nature and nature's sinks and carbon reserves. So it's a different mindset.
Jim, you mentioned shorelines, and I think that's an important topic in Texas. How do we take care of our shorelines? And one of the things that you'll hear people talking about is this term you'll hear blue carbon. And blue carbon refers to actions that we take that increase carbon storage throughout the ocean, but especially along that shoreline. And I want to point to mangroves, because mangroves are extremely good at storing carbon, not just in the body of the tree itself, but because those roots hold that sediment in. Mangroves act as a point of accumulation, both for organic matter that's washing down our rivers, and then they also slow the mixing in the region and they reduce decomposition. So mangroves are a big win from many dimensions. They're a win from storing CO2. They're a win because they buffer, they take some of that energy out when hurricanes come over our coastlines before they come to our cities. And then they're a win because, frankly, they build land if given enough time. They allow sediment to accumulate, and we see protection from erosion of our shorelines as well. So that's one kind of a nature-based solution would be we talked about. So what have we talked about so far? We talked about trees. We talked about forests on land. We've talked about shoreline reconstruction, and then mangroves in particular as a type of shoreline reconstruction. We talked about increasing soil carbon through better ranching and farming practices. There are a whole bunch more. I mentioned biochar as well.
Can you tell folks what biochar is? Because I think it's one that's probably not as familiar, but it does seem to be popping up a lot right now. It seems like biochar is having a moment.
Biochar is absolutely having a moment. And I, if you don't mind, I would like to get there by talking about how we think about whether or not a carbon credit is valuable.
Please.
Because that's one of the reasons that biochar is having a moment. So permanence is something that we think about defining the value. How much it costs to create that carbon sink is an important part of the value. Is it going to cost you more to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere than you're going to get on the carbon market from selling that? That's a significant concern for some CO2 removal methods. So permanence, cost. We've talked a little bit about co-benefits, and the market is still trying to figure out how to value co-benefits. How important to us is it that this CO2 removal approach may create jobs in our community, for example, or may increase, as soil carbon does. Soil carbon increases crop yield, and it also improves the ability of our lands to hold water. It reduces water use. And all of these co-benefits are still shaking out in terms of how, when you look at how much a company is willing to pay for a particular carbon credit, maybe they'll pay more for this credit than that credit. So the reason biochar is having a moment. So biochar is biochar is charcoal that's made intentionally for the purposes of adding to soil. So it's when you take biomass like grass that would otherwise decompose to CO2 very rapidly, and you convert it to charcoal through pyrolysis. So you don't burn it. You heat it in the absence of oxygen, which causes it to condense into charcoal. And then you intentionally put that charcoal back in your soil. And it's funny, when I moved here in 2004, I remember going to T's Nursery on Holcomb. And I went in the back and I saw a big bag of charcoal for sale. And I asked the guy, why do you sell charcoal? And he said, oh, that's for your soil. And I was already working on biochar at that point. And so I just asked him, okay, what does it do? Why would you add that to your soil? And he just looked at me and he said, it makes the gumbo drain better. And it's in the case of Texas, Houston area soils, biochar definitely improves our drainage as well. So biochar is having a moment because charcoal's permanence in soils is much longer. So we fight about how long charcoal stays in soils, but we can confidently say that it's somewhere between 100 and 10,000 years. And even 100 years of permanence is a
that's
big
fabulous.
deal.
I mean,
Compared to trees, which can be 10 to 50 years, maybe. Having something that could stay in soil for 500, 1,000, 10,000 years is a really big deal. So biochar is cheap to make, long permanence, and it has agronomic co-benefits in that on average, it improves crop yields by about 15%. And I want to emphasize that average number. In some cases, it improves crop yields by a whole lot more. And in some cases, you don't see any benefit. So that's going to be very specific to a crop. And there's a whole field of agronomists now who can advise you on whether or not the crop you're growing with the soils you're using are going to benefit from biochar.
I'm curious about if you can say a little bit, and I know without getting into some specifics, it's a little tricky. But how much is biochar something that folks can use and reuse? Is it something we can kind of put on the soil once and then, I mean, it's there for a long time. So is that the full extent, or is it something that we can repeatedly use in agriculture or gardening or whatever it may be?
Yeah. So you're asking. Actually, Jim and I were just talking about this yesterday. how much biochar can you put into a soil? And I think that's not something that's fully understood. We do know that you can reach a point where you stop getting benefits from it. So you'll get a plateau in benefits. You're not there. I have not seen studies where, for example, there's any negative crop yield benefits, but you do reach a point where the crop yield stops getting higher. There are certainly cases where people are using almost 100% biochar for specific types of environments. So you would consider something like that. You would think about biochar, for example, in a green roof soil because it is so much lighter than so biochar density can be as low as 0.4 grams per cubic centimeter. Compare that to something like sand, which is more than 2.5 grams per centimeter. So it's just a lot lighter.
Almost like 5 times as much.
Yeah, it's structurally a lot better for your house if you're putting charcoal on your roof and not sand. So there are cases where large amounts of it are very useful. I don't think we know how much. I would say that's an
area for further research.
I have a friend who's working on that.
Yeah, and one of the things I think coming out of the nature-based solutions conference that we had at Rice was trying to understand who all is working here at Rice on these different elements about, in this case, say just carbon crediting, and who can, one of the students is trying to develop a biochar protocol right now. And we're finding there's a lot of issues to writing a protocol, things that I hadn't necessarily thought about. B Carbon doesn't have a biochar protocol yet. We'd like to go ahead and probably adopt one. But just going through and really having, if you will, the science at Rice to back up a registry that is out in the public and is trying to certainly issue credits that are hopefully going to be transacted on the marketplace. To have that solid science backing it's so important because there's a lot of charlatans out there. I mean, it is an unregulated marketplace. Yeah. And so the science that backs this up really becomes essential. And, I think the companies sometimes get criticized too much for kind of, if you will, trying something and making a mistake. I think we all should be very forgiving about innovative concepts to try to solve this problem that, frankly, we didn't know we were creating 100 years ago. This has all happened, and the realization of it has really come up in the probably last 30 to 40 years. Probably it's spectacularly here in Houston after Harvey. So it's kind of a recent, if you will, understanding of the severity and what we have to do. And I think sometimes we take this gotcha type of approach. I think it comes out of our political system. It comes out of perhaps journalism. But I think we need to approach a lot of these issues much more collaboratively, much more cooperatively, and with kind of an open eye toward learning and expanding. We're finding out, for example, drought has a huge impact on soil carbon. And I'm not sure any of us knew that, thought that was going to be a big variable 5 or 10 years ago when we were first starting on this. That may change all of the thinking about management concepts. There are the agricultural universities. If you talk to a rancher, not a single rancher I know has an algorithm to tell them how to think about carbon income versus cattle income. And when do you take your cattle off to optimize carbon? And when can, how do those things go? There's no algorithms for that. There's no professors teaching that subject yet. I mean, so we are so early on this in some regards. And on the other hand, we're, kind of putting people up and, putting companies up for public criticism because they made a mistake. And I'm just becoming... I am a lawyer. I have litigated. I have accused companies of doing the wrong thing. And I think that the mindset we need going forward is actually quite different than the mindset we've had for the last 40 years in environmental law, 50 years.
That's a fascinating shift. And one certainly that I think feels very Houston, which I'm glad you bring up the conference, because I did want to pivot slightly over to an opening question, and then I think just a little more of just things that are happening in Houston. But Carrie, at the beginning you had actually opened, and one of the things on your list is that Houston is a uniquely good place for some of these carbon experiments, carbon credit experiments. So I'm curious if you want to say more about why we're so well positioned here in particular, and then maybe how that broadens out to some of the conversations that came up at the conference more broadly around nature-based solutions happening here in town.
I think, tell me if this is what you are thinking about, Weston. My first response to that is that Houston is just a very experimental community.
Yeah.
We tolerate lots of attempts to change things. You can try stuff in Texas that you can't try in other places, and that's both good and bad. But in the space of carbon markets, we really have a lot of opportunity to imagine new approaches and work with partners to play them out, see what we can do.
As Jim was describing this kind of Wild West landscape of emerging markets, it certainly does feel very Houston. We do love the rodeo here in town, so yeah. It does fit. So then, tell me a little about some of the specific projects that you heard about or that were brought up at the conference, and things that we should be looking for in terms of new. Because there were certainly a number of Rice speakers, but there's also folks you had in from the city, folks from different. Folks really around the whole region as well. And I think a lot of what was exciting was a number of different projects that are maybe getting off the ground, maybe in design, but things that folks are hoping to build up to help keep us a little safer here in town.
Well, the nature-based solutions that, I didn't see all of the conference, but saw much of it. I would say it really kind of divided into those that were more of what I call non-structural engineering approaches to flooding, using, if you will, low spots, wetlands, designing landscape scale features that would hold water, that were integrated from a natural standpoint. That's a whole area of civil engineering that is really expanding, that really has nothing to do with carbon or carbon credits or that type of thing. But that's a kind of, if you will, the nature-based solution from a flooding standpoint. There were also carbon-related aspects that were talked about, and there were, I think, kind of almost everything in between. I think it was really interesting to see the variety of approaches and thinking that existed here at Rice. There's a richness here from certainly a biodiversity standpoint, talking about how that may fit into all of this thinking. Is it possible at some point that we're talking about an economic system that recognizes biodiversity as a key element of economic prosperity? That's a whole different level of question than some of the stuff I'm working with carbon credits. That's kind of very practical. Will somebody pay for something that somebody can develop? I think we're learning about the water supply side. Can we protect springs in the Texas Hill Country by selling carbon credits and preventing development around them and therefore keeping groundwater from being exploited? I mean, we're seeing Jacob's Well in Wimberley is dry. A number of springs are dry, and we're experiencing a horrible drought right now. But it's not going to get any better in the future. And we're going to have to do things differently. And so I think a lot of what we saw were, if you will, scientists kind of trying to explore how what they knew might come to play in this space. And to me, that was the most fun part of the conference.
You mentioned biodiversity, and one of the things that's pleasantly surprised me has been the number of inquiries that we're getting from businesses about how to think about biodiversity in the carbon credit space. How do we develop protocols that account for biodiversity preservation or account for expansion of biodiversity? So I had assumed that businesses would come in and be very hard-headed about, no, we need to pull X tons of CO2 out per year, and we want to do this in the least expensive way. And I think there certainly are some folks who are thinking from that perspective, but we're hearing more from businesses who are saying things like, we know we need to account for the effects of our practices on biodiversity. How are these carbon credits positively or sometimes negatively interacting or affecting local biodiversity? That was a surprise to me, the enthusiasm for that.
And there's interest in this. We talk about co-benefits. The carbon credit, the nature-based carbon credit, can be very positive with regard to protection and preservation of biodiversity. It can be positive from a water supply or a flooding standpoint. It can be positive from, if you think of biodiversity, the pollinators, the monarch butterfly trail. I'm developing some carbon credits that will protect the ocelot, which is a endangered species down the coast. Whooping crane credits for coastal blue carbon, where we're protecting whooping crane wintering habitat. Companies, there's a story to carbon. And the companies that are doing it voluntarily. They are doing it publicly. They oftentimes are writing up articles about it in their environmental reporting that virtually every company now does environmental reporting. It's probably one of those huge shifts that has taken place in the last 20 or 30 years. And they will write up the co-benefits. And that becomes part of a narrative about what the company is doing in any number of areas. And it doesn't make a difference to every company, but there's some companies it makes quite a large difference to. Now, what we're trying to figure out is we've been trying to determine if there's a market for simply a biodiversity credit that is not carbon related. And there's not much appetite for that yet. But it wouldn't surprise me to see this issue kind of revisited in 10 years, and it may have a very different answer.
It does seem like it's been changing fast on the ground. There's so much more. Just, I think 10 years ago, your average person, if you'd said biodiversity, would be kind of like, what? What does that mean? And that's to some extent still needs to be addressed. But it's certainly, and for those who are unfamiliar, I encourage you to go back and listen to our podcast earlier episodes where we talk all about what biodiversity is. But I think that's certainly changed. We're rapidly approaching the end of our time, so I just want to say thank you both so much for all of this and the fascinating work that you're doing and sharing with us some of these exciting projects and some of the changes that are happening in both carbon markets, but also the city more broadly. Professor Jim Blackburn, Dr. Carrie Masiello, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Lots of fun, as always.
Yeah, and Carrie, it's fun being with you on here. So
I always love the opportunity to chat, Jim.
Absolutely.
That's our show for today. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Original music by Carter Dean. Research support provided by Jaden Brayboy, Sophia Soltez, and Neman Rinsdorf. Stay tuned for No Expectations with Marcus French here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.